A lot of people seem to be confused by the topic of latency and buffer or block size and the different features that we have available in Studio One to help us manage latency. So I wanted to make a video that's going to hopefully make this topic palatable to complete beginners, intermediate users, or anyone else who's struggling with understanding all of this. So now I want to be very specific that when we're talking about latency, this is particular to when we are monitoring a signal that we're recording in. So let's first take a look at what that looks like, the whole idea of latency. Now here I've got an audio track, and this is not armed or for recording or monitoring. Now, as soon as I click on record arm, then we have monitoring as well. We don't even need to have record arm. We can just engage monitoring. So you can see this is very specific to when we want to hear the incoming signal back through our headphones. And we can hear that there's a pretty significant delay from the time that I speak, and then we can hear the monitored signal. Now, how does this manifest itself with a virtual instrument? So here I've got a MIDI on this track, and this is armed for record and monitoring. Now I'm going to press caps lock to bring up the virtual QWERTY keyboard. And we can just take note of the Q here. I'm going to press Q on my QWERTY keyboard. And we can see in here that there's a pretty good delay from the time that I press Q and our synthesizer is triggered. Now this is our latency that we're dealing with on our audio and our instrument track. So let's close out the virtual QWERTY keyboard, and I'm going to Control comma to bring up our options menu on the audio setup tab. We can see that I'm using Windows Audio here. Now, if I were using my Focusrite audio interface and I want to change the buffer size to get rid of that latency, that delay, then I can use the drop-down menu or the slider on the right. And some audio interfaces, you may need to click on the control panel button and access the proprietary software for that audio interface, and you can lower the block or buffer size there. Now this is going to help you with getting rid of that delay that we were just experiencing. Now for Windows Audio, I can come to the control panel and we can see latency is here in milliseconds. And I'm going to click here and take this down to about 30. So now we've taken the latency down, and the important thing to keep in mind is that this potentially can and will increase your CPU load and activity for your song. And just in general, we'll go ahead and close and let's click OK. We'll come to our audio track. And now when I arm this for record and monitoring, we can hear that the delay is not as bad as it was before. So it's a bit better. We can't work miracles with Windows Audio, but you should be able to do much better if you're using a USB audio interface. Now, if we come back to our virtual instrument, the MIDI, let's caps lock for our virtual QWERTY keyboard. I'll again press Q, and if you take note, when this is lighting up, the delay is mostly gone from when I trigger by pressing Q and when we hear back our virtual instrument. Now, the one issue with just taking our latency, our buffer size down as we just did, is that this is going to increase the CPU usage because our block size, let's control comma to bring this back, our block size is basically the amount of time that we're telling our CPU, hey, I want you to make calculations to the incoming signals, whether it's a vocal and guitar being recorded into Studio One and then back out to your headphones. There's calculations happening. Even if you were to just do something small like move a fader like this while you're monitoring, then your processor is making calculations because Studio One is changing the incoming audio and then playing those changes back to you. And you can imagine if you had a guitar that you're recording on, say, the audio, and you're using a virtual amp simulator plugin, then there's a lot of number crunching that needs to happen there in order for the processing to happen to your guitar to then you hear back that process signal in your headphones or speakers. So this whole idea of the block or buffer size relates to how much time we're giving our CPU or our computer to make those calculations. So the less time we give it, the lower we take the block size, then the CPU has to work harder. And then what can that can result in is crackling and popping. So if I play this song back, I'm not actually hearing any crackling or popping in my headphones that I'm monitoring through. There may be some in the video because it just ends up there when I'm working with Windows Audio and my screen capture. I never hear it when I'm recording the tutorials, but sometimes it's just in there when Studio One is playing back audio. But anyhow, outside of the screen capture, I'm not hearing crackling or popping in my headphones. But if you take your buffer size down and you do experience that, then you'll know you need to go back to your options menu, the audio setup, and increase the block size or latency for your audio device. Now for me, in my experience, if I'm using an external audio interface, taking the buffer or block size down to 128 or below seems to work best for me on my system as far as getting rid of the latency and the delay in what I'm hearing in the monitored signal and a good balance of CPU usage. You'll have to find that for your own system. But once you do, you can go ahead and leave that block size the same as it is. You shouldn't really have to change that unless you change to a different audio interface. So for my Windows, if we go to the control panel, I'm going to go ahead and leave this at 30 because that gets us mostly out of that delay and the latency that we were experiencing when I had it up really high. Now let's go ahead and click OK. Now let's take a look at a couple of different ways that we can go about managing the latency and the processing usage that's happening here. So Studio One provides a way in that we can work with the lower block size if we are monitoring and recording, but then upon playback or any channels or tracks that are not being monitored, we're going to make use of a higher block size, thus less CPU usage. So if I click on performance here, then we can see in the performance monitor window, I have dropout protection, and we can see that currently that's set to off. Let's close that out and then come to the mix console and open that up. So we can see on our mix bus, our master channel, we don't have a Z down here. That's not showing. And that is because if we come back to the performance, our dropout protection is turned off. So we can click on this drop-down menu and turn this to say high. And then we can see now we have the green Z that populates in our mix bus. I'm going to take this back to off. Let's close this window out. I'm going to control comma to bring up our options menu just to show that we can come to the processing tab here. And we can see that we can change our dropout protection here as well. So by clicking on this drop-down menu, we can see we had that high setting that I just selected from the performance window. Now, one thing I want to make note of is that, we don't see the Z on our master channel, and that is because our process block size, 441 samples, if we come back here, this is 441 samples. So the block size is both the same right now because this is set to off. Now I can change this to low, and you can see we still are at 441. That's not really making a change here for our processing block size, and we don't have the Z. But if I come up to medium or high or maximum, most certainly the high and the maximum, we can now see that our process block size is 1323. Our audio device is still at 441. And I think this is where a lot of people get confused about this feature. So just think of it this way. This block size or buffer size is what we're going to use when we come to an audio track and record arm and monitor it back in our speakers or headphones. It's going to use, that track is going to use this. Okay, so we'll come back to our processing. We can see that dropout protection is set to high and we're at 1323 samples. Okay, so let's go ahead and click on OK and see what that looks like. We'll come to our test audio input, that audio track that we've been working with at the beginning of the video. And I'm going to go ahead and record arm. Check 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, so there's still a significant delay in that, but why is that? And that's because we need to take the extra step of telling Studio One to use the lower block size here of 441 samples, because right now we're using the much higher one of 1323. And so we do that by clicking on the Z here. So when we click on the Z and engage that, we switch from using 1323 and we switch to this one here of 441. So we should have less of a delay when we engage the Z here. So let's go ahead and turn on our monitoring. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now I'm going to engage the Z. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, again, this is because when we switch on the Z, we're telling Studio One to use the audio device block size here at the lower 441. If the green Z is not engaged, then we're going to make use of our process block size here. Now we can even see a readout of the audio round trip. So when our Z is not engaged, when this is turned off, our round trip in milliseconds is 174 from your microphone or your MIDI keyboard into the computer, into Studio One, back out to your headphones or speakers. Now, if you engage the Z, we can see they put the Z next to here, and that's what we're in right now, then we have a round trip of 100 milliseconds. Now, if I were to take the dropout protection up to maximum, now we can see we're all the way up to 2205 samples, and our audio round trip jumps up to 234 milliseconds. Our low latency, which is engaged right now, is still at 100 milliseconds, because when we engage the Z, we're making use of this one here that we really should just keep the same once we find a good balance for our computer with recording, audio, and instruments, and not overtaxing our processor. Okay, so now that I've taken this up to the maximum, let's go ahead and click OK. Let's turn off the green Z. So now we're switching to block size of 2205. Once I turn monitoring on, 1, 2, 3, 4. Now when we engage the Z, 1, 2, 3, 4. We're making use of the device block size here of 441. And I know I keep harping on this, but I just really want to make sure that it's clear. Let's click OK and come back to our song here. Now, what about for our MIDI instrument? We'll come back to our MIDI. We'll caps lock. Let's turn off. We'll leave the Z on here on the mix bus. Caps lock for our virtual keyboard. Again, take note of the cue. Okay, so it seems like there's still a delay from when I trigger and when we hear back. Well, why is that when the Z is turned on our audio? That's because this specifically relates to monitoring audio signals, the Z on our mix bus. There's another area for our instruments that we would need to engage to change it for the instruments. So we will move our QWERTY keyboard out of the way for a second here, and let's show our instrument rack. Actually, this one here. Now we can see at the top of our instrument rack, we have a Z here. This one is not turned on. This one is. So this will help us with our audio latency when engaged there. But if we're going to be working and monitoring virtual instruments, we need to engage here. So before this is turned on, we can see the responsiveness here. Then once I turn on the Z here, we can see that that's almost immediate. Because just as with our audio, when we engage the Z for our instruments, our virtual instruments, we're then making use of this when we are monitoring our instruments, when we're playing live and monitoring in our headphones or speakers. So now when we come to our processing tab, we can see we have a Z next to our instrument section here, and we can see the round trip. 210, if we have the Z turned off here, is our standard round trip in milliseconds. If we engage the Z here in our instrument rack, then our round trip is going to be 70 milliseconds. So again, to reiterate for the millionth time, if I turn off the Z on our master channel here, we're going to switch from 100 milliseconds round trip to 234 milliseconds. Because we have our dropout protection set to maximum, and that's going to take this samples higher, our block higher, our round trip higher. If we have the Z engaged in our instrument rack, then our instruments, when we're triggering with our MIDI controller and hearing back in our headphones or speakers, our round trip is going to be 70 milliseconds. If we turn off the Z in our instrument rack, then we're going to switch to using what we have set here, and that's going to be 210 milliseconds for our round trip from triggering our MIDI controller and hearing back in our speakers or headphones. And also take note that this Z can be activated within the Audio Setup tab by clicking here. If I turn that off, then we can see that the Z is turned off here, and our Z goes away from here, letting us know that that's not engaged. Once I click the checkbox, we can see our Z come back here, and we also have the Z turned on in our instrument rack. Okay, so this went a little bit longer than I had intended, but I was really trying to make this clear, and I hope that it's been helpful if you've been struggling to understand latency and how to make use of these low latency features that are available within Studio One. If you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment down below. And also, if you're someone who's struggling getting started in Studio One, I do provide one-on-one training via Zoom. So if you're interested in pursuing that with me, then check out the information or the link in the pinned comment or the description of this video. Otherwise, I hope to see you in the next tutorial.